This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. We often think of Nintendo games in terms of franchises, with one game leading to the next by way of technology and design. Super Mario 64 leads to Super Mario Sunshine, then Galaxy, Galaxy 2, 3D Land, 3D World, and eventually Super Mario Odyssey. The same goes for The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Pikmin, Splatoon, and countless others, but rarely do we see the actual roads leading from one game to another. The engine behind Mario 64 gradually evolving into Ocarina of Time, or the tech behind Xenoblade Chronicles X acting as a sister engine to that of Breath of the Wild. The reality is that the technology and design philosophies of one series often cross over into another and form new and unique combos. But what if I told you that every Nintendo game made since they made the jump to 3D could be traced back to a single pivotal point? A point at which the sprite was exchanged for the polygon. On February 21st, 1993, Nintendo, in partnership with a group of young developers from England, released Star Fox for the Super Nintendo, first to Japan and then worldwide. It was built on the back of a Japan-exclusive Game Boy game called X. With the technology behind Star Fox, the legendary game designers at Nintendo would begin exploring the concept of 3D platforming, puzzle solving, and exploration. With the power of their next system, the Nintendo 64, experiments with Mario and Zelda in 3D would come to fruition, and from there the world of Nintendo would become three-dimensional. This year, Star Fox celebrates its 30th anniversary. While the Star Fox series has proved somewhat divisive over the years, with audience reception often falling short of the initial entries, its importance to Nintendo's history is incontrovertible. My name is John Rairdin, and today I invite you to join me in exploring the history of this legendary game alongside some of its original developers, and celebrate its legacy with fans like myself and developers for whom Star Fox proved influential. This is the story of Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. The story of Star Fox begins years earlier, with a group of young developers, many of them still teenagers, at a company called Argonaut in London. Argonaut itself was founded by Jez San in 1982. He was only 16 at the time, with a focus on developing 3D games for the home computers of the time. In the years that followed, Argonaut would amass a team of talented young programmers with a passion for 3D gaming.
Hi, I'm Giles Goddard, programmer on Star Fox. I stumbled my way into games originally. I wasn't a game designer, I was basically just programming in my bedroom making demos. There were no 3D games at that point, really. There was 2 or 3 wireframe games for the Amiga, and that was it. And Argonaut were one of the few games making 3D games, so that's what drew me to them. My first game, I guess, would have been Starglider for the Amiga. So I did the Atari ST port. Starglider. I think Starglider was my favorite. But I also made a stunt race effects type game way before I joined Nintendo, and I almost completed it, and then wiped the disk that it was stored on, so it just lost it completely. And that was before we had backups and stuff. I think it was my idea to make stunt race effects because I lost the original game that I made. It was called Accelerate. It was a great name. XLR8.
Hello, I'm Dylan Cuthbert. I got into game design by initially writing out programs from magazines into my old trusty 8-bit ZX81 back in 1981. I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I just got really hooked into the whole process of making my own games, and initially, copied some games like Pac-Man. I tried to make my own version of Pac-Man. When I first got my ZX Spectrum, it actually came with a 3D modeling package, believe it or not, called VU3D. And that was my first experience of 3D on any computer. And that was in 1982 or 83, somewhere around there. And there were actually quite a few 3D games on the 8-bit machines, including Star Strike 2. There was even a version of Hard Driving. There was even a train simulator called Southern Belle. And I think this all got me quite interested in 3D. I do remember programming a test in BASIC, even on the ZX81, to try and project points into 3D onto the screen. I didn't get very far with it, but I did actually try. So I found Argonaut through an advert in one of the computer magazines at the time, and I was still at school. I think I was like about 16, and I just got an Amiga the previous summer. I'd saved up my pocket money, and I was interested in doing games. And I thought one of the first games I got from my Amiga was Star Glider 2 for the Amiga, which was quite an impressive 3D game. And I wanted to do something similar to that, so I applied for a job and got rejected initially because I only had 2D demos. I had some pretty good 2D demos, so I impressed them with those. But then a few months later, I sent them in a demo on the Amiga, 3D demo, just like a rotating logo in 3D. And I got a call the next day from Jez and he said, like, do you want a job? And I said, yep. And I quit school and joined Argonaut.
So Argonaut, the company Argonaut in Edgware was, the office was just some guy's house that he turned into a game studio. And every day we had sort of this weird team assemble.
Argonaut software was run from a 3-story semi-detached house in North London with a group of basically kids who were, the average age was probably like 19 or 20. And they were just crazy. They were a really, really fun team.
If your knowledge of video games in the 80s is based primarily on home consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System, then the work Argonaut was doing at that same time will look like magic. So it's important to understand the culture split in game development and consumption between the United States and Europe in the early 80s. Throughout the 70s, Atari had dominated the video game industry, but by the early 80s, an overabundance of different consoles and computers, in addition to inconsistent quality control when it came to actual software, caused American consumers to lose faith in home video games. The heavy US-based presence in the home console market took a massive hit, and what would come to be known as the video game crash lasted from around 1983 until the launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. Meanwhile, in Europe, that same crash simply never took place. Computers, as opposed to home consoles, had taken root in Europe. With a strong homebrew culture built around young people coding and distributing their own games, the industry was thriving. With comparatively stronger hardware next to home consoles of the time, game developers like Argonaut helped to usher the computer gaming market into 3D long before home consoles were ready to do the same. Once Japan had taken dominance in the home console market and things had stabilized in the US, Argonaut found themselves in the perfect position to help guide Nintendo into the third dimension. But not just on their home consoles. Nintendo's first fully 3D game would arrive on the Game Boy.
They said it wasn't humanly possible, but now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy.
So X, or Lunar Chase, or even Eclipse as it was called originally, was a demo that I was asked to make on the Game Boy by Jez Sam. And the reason why is because I had the 8-bit experience, because I'd learned the program in Z80 on the ZX81 and the Sinclair Spectrum. And of course the Game Boy was a Z80 variant, and you wanted someone who had actually had experience in that CPU. And so I was assigned that, and I started doing like 3D rasterization and polygons and getting a little demo going.
Dylan makes the process of running a 3D game on an 8-bit monochrome Game Boy sound pretty easy, but the simple task of getting a game running on the Game Boy at all took some doing, because Argonaut didn't have a dev kit. Instead, they needed to reverse engineer a retail Game Boy and defeat Nintendo's copyright protection. Which, of course, this group of teenagers running a development studio out of a small house absolutely did. Thanks to our friends at the Video Game History Foundation, we're able to give you this exclusive sneak peek at that demo that Cuthbert created for the first time in 30 years. In fact, we're in the process of collaborating with the Video Game History Foundation on an in-depth look at this demo alongside programmer Dylan Cuthbert. We weren't quite able to get it out in time to coincide with this video due to scheduling issues, but stay tuned for much more information on this demo very soon.
And I kind of pulled upon some of the 3D games back in the day. One was called Ball Blazer. I wanted to get that sort of experience of like firing lots of balls across like a flat 3D landscape. And the other thing I pulled on was a game called Micronaut 1, which had these kind of 3D tunnels that you flew through. And I kind of wanted to try and see if I could do a similar thing on the Game Boy. So I kind of tied all that up into the 3D shooting game that X became.
The Eclipse demo eventually made its way to Japan and into the hands of the Game Boy's creator, the legendary Gunpei Yokoi.
I first went to Japan about 2 weeks after the X, or the Lunar Chase demo was shown to Nintendo, and they bundled me and Jez onto a plane to Kyoto or to Japan, and it was the first time really going any further than basically England, and it was quite an experience. When I was landing at the Osaka airport, I had a sudden sort of thought that flashed through my mind that I didn't actually know anything about Japan whatsoever, never mind the language. Maybe it was a communist country even, I had no idea, but it was all made it, I suppose it made it all the more exciting not to know anything about the country. So when Nintendo saw X on the Game Boy, before it was called X obviously, and before Nintendo owned it, they were so surprised that we had 3D running on the Game Boy that they started talking to us about getting 3D running on the Super Nintendo, and they wanted help getting good 3D on the Super Nintendo, and that's where the Super FX chip came about. And we kind of worked with them over the next 2 years while I was making X to develop that chip.
Nintendo purchased the rights to the Eclipse demo, which would be developed into a full game and released in 1992 as X in Japan. A Western release called Lunar Chase was also planned, but it was ultimately decided that the game was unlikely to perform well outside of Japan. The Lunar Chase ROM has since found its way online, allowing fans to play the game in English for the first time. While X was in development, Argonaut was also pitching Nintendo on doing much more complex 3D on their upcoming home console, the Super Nintendo. But would the Super Nintendo be able to deliver an experience that could stand up to what was already playable in arcades and on home computers?
You gotta remember, the year Star Fox came out is also the year that Sega released Daytona USA in the arcades, which sports visuals on par with something you'd see on the Sega Dreamcast in 1998 and beyond, right? Like, Sega was bringing the future. And 3D arcade games with more detail had been around since like iRobot back in like 84. Namco's Winning Run and Sega's Virtua Racing prior to Star Fox, those were big in the arcade and were huge showpiece titles, right? Basically like, here's new technology, full 3D flat shaded polygons running very smoothly. But you know, these were expensive, right? Like Sega's Model 2 that powered the Daytona USA boards, I mean, that was thousands and thousands of dollars, right? This was not something that consumers could have at their home. The PC space was not nearly as advanced as the arcade, obviously, but by then it was starting to get some decent looking 3D with like shading and some better textures. I mean, stuff like X-Wing was out. TIE Fighter would come the next year, then we get like Wing Commander 3, and so like 3D graphics and movement and such was all it was becoming a big deal and pretty common on the PC by the time Star Fox hit. But the console space was completely different. It was dominated at the time by primarily 16-bit machines. Most of the stuff that we saw in the world of 3D at that point to date on consoles was like the more scaled back, super scaler kind of stuff, right? Like think Outrun, not nearly as good as arcade, but that's the kind of stuff people were doing at home.
3D was very much a PC only, Amiga only type concept at that time. So the idea of putting it onto a console was, totally out there. And everybody thought, it wasn't possible. The thing that Argonaut did was showed Nintendo that it was actually possible to do that. It just needed a slight hardware boost. with Star Fox, we originally tried to make a Starglider, not clone, but base it off Starglider.
Argonaut ultimately developed a demo entitled SNES Glider, heavily inspired by their own Starglider series. The demo featured full 3D movement, an open environment, and an extremely low frame rate. Argonaut showed this demo to Nintendo as an example of what could be done on stock Super Nintendo hardware.
And we discovered that, it could do 3D, but it just wasn't enough. So Jez said to Nintendo, give us some money. We can make a chip that can actually do 3D on your new hardware at a reasonable cost. So they gave us money to do that, and we made the chip for, quite not a lot of money.
Nintendo, impressed with their work, sent them off with what would today be the equivalent of roughly $2.5 million to develop what would become the Super FX chip.
The way it came about was, I think, probably Pete Warren's and Carl Graham's idea, I think maybe, or at least they did the early prototypes, whatever. And basically the way it works is it's a DSP, and a DSP is a chip that used to move large amounts of data around very quickly.
There was a lot of games using add-in chips, so it only made sense to do a coprocessor kind of design where you offload all the mathematical calculations to this chip and spit that down through the cartridge port, and then the Super NES can fire that up to the screen and you've got real 3D. Yes, these consoles have their CPUs and their graphics processing and built-in memory and all that, but games themselves were read from chips, like mask ROM chips. So all the interaction with the game code happened through that cartridge bus. And theoretically, as long as you had enough bandwidth in that cartridge bus to pass the data and actually, do what you need to do, then it was okay to essentially call something and run a program on the cartridge, or just more simple things like that, like just shifting memory registers and, that kind of stuff. But the system itself doesn't necessarily need to see any of that. Like, all that stuff can happen on the cartridge, and the system itself doesn't really know what's going on, right? It only sees what's being fed to it through the bus. So it kind of opens up the doors for doing all kinds of weird, crazy calculations. That's just not really possible anymore, because that live cartridge bus was actually like a live thing where data bits were passing back and forth in real time, and memory was being read and all that kind of stuff in a way that's completely different from like flash ROM or the way things work today. You can't like insert something, not that there'd be space for it, but you imagine like the Switch or something, right? That doesn't, the way that reads the cartridge, it doesn't like directly interface with what's on that cartridge in a way like a Super NES does. It's an old school method of doing things. And I mean, arcade boards were basically like, what if we just throw as many chips as we want at the game? It's like as much memory chips as we need, any extra processors or DSPs or anything we need, we just stick it on the board. This model's the same basic concept. It's just, going over this cartridge.
While Argonaut set to work on the Super FX chip, the top brass at Nintendo went in search of a producer for this new 3D Super Nintendo game, and handed the SNES Glider demo off to Super Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto.
So we were at 18, 19, whatever. We didn't really get the significance of working with Miyamoto so much, I think. We were more interested in having a good time, sort of thing. So it wasn't obvious at the time that we were working on a massive game, what was going to be a massive game. Also, it was experimental. They didn't know if it was going to sell. That was also that we didn't know if it was going to be a good game.
So I had no idea who Miyamoto was when I met him. When we were introduced, one of the Nintendo Romero guys who was with us kind of said, "Oh, this is Miyamoto and he made Mario." But at that point in the UK, Mario wasn't really a big thing. Like, this is late 80s. The name Nintendo we kind of knew about, and we kind of knew of Mario, but not many people actually played Mario at that point in time in the UK. So I wasn't particularly in awe, apart from the fact that he'd made a game that I'd heard of. And so that made it quite interesting. It made it quite a sort of balanced relationship, I suppose.
Nobody spoke Japanese, but they spoke really good English, and they showed us around and they helped us out. So, they were a huge help. Japan was very different back then. There was no support for foreigners, really. So it was a huge culture shock. being in a country where you can't even say where you want to go or read signs or do anything, basically.
When we arrived at Nintendo, I mean, these are like proper corporate buildings with secretaries and cleaning staff even. I mean, we didn't have any cleaning people at Argonaut. And the whole thing was quite an eye-opener. Completely different experience, much more professional, and it felt like the games industry was already like a proper industry in Japan, whereas in the UK it was really still just a bedroom industry, and that was, quite a stark contrast, really.
The working environment Nintendo was very 80s, 90s, I'd say. So everybody was smoking at their desks. It was very, very old-fashioned factory-type environment. Very white, no character. The rooms were just very bland, white. The desks were bland. It didn't really feel like a fun place to work at, but it was still fun working with the team, who were all obviously Japanese. They didn't speak much English, so there was lots of interesting, weird conversations we had.
With a team assembled, hardware in place, and everyone at least trying to speak the same language, Star Fox was beginning to take shape. Like most great Miyamoto-led games, inspiration for the actual gameplay would come from everyday life.
When there's an arch, you want to go under it, right? That's the kind of game I wanted to make. I live right by the Fushimi Inari Shrine. I've had a relation with this shrine since I was a child. Thinking about the shrine, this place is known for the row of arches. So we went with this idea to create a game where you would fly through different arches.
So when we were making Star Fox, we played a lot of this game called Starblade. And Starblade was an old 3D arcade machine that was on rails but not on rails. So it means that it kind of, you're going along a path but you can change where you're looking. So it feels like you're in control but you're not really. So that's what we were kind of aiming for with Star Fox. So we wanted a kind of a hybrid, make it feel like it's controllable but it's actually still on rails.
If you play Starblade and you play Star Fox, the core is pretty much the same. Yeah. So and it was quite unique at the time. So you shoot at these scripted enemies that come in and they flash when they hit, which was at that time no one really did that. So I mean that was stuff I actually brought in the original Star Fox, and then what we did is it's only the core, because then Star Fox expands it completely into, because it's more free form, it has more of an adventure, and it has items that dropped, and there's a lot more scripting going on and stuff. But that little core is really the same.
We designed the courses on very long pieces of paper, starting from the top is the start of the course, the bottom is the end of the course, and we'd feed that into locations and timings in a big array in the computer.
The system that we used for the original Star Fox, which is developing the game kind of more organically, I suppose, like developing the ideas to each stage without laying them out as like a physical stage. They were scripted, they were like events. The whole system was like an event system, which made each stage really kind of exciting and different. And I think that was one of the core aspects of the original Star Fox that was really cool.
In other words, levels didn't exist as continuous 3D models as they would in a modern game. Rather, they were more like a list, a series of events that would queue one after the other. For example, you fly through a set of buildings, which would then cause a set of enemies to appear. The next part of the stage would then only appear once those enemies were defeated or had left the screen. This has the inherent benefit of keeping what was loaded into memory and being displayed on screen at any given time tightly controlled, which was helpful, as even with their prototype Super Effects chip, the Super Nintendo was punching way above its weight.
We did come across lots of limits with the hardware when we were doing it, especially the chip, because the chip was very early prototype, very buggy. So we were debugging the chip as we were making the game, so there were lots of gotchas throughout the game.
One of my favorite features is on the Fortuna planet. Basically, it has all the sort of disjointed tentacles coming out of the ground, and you've got the big King Dodora giant chicken boss thing. That is way to one of my favorite things to make. I actually made that boss as well, and also most of the stuff in that stage, and I really enjoyed making that.
There was one enemy that I really, really wanted to put in, and everybody thought it was crazy when I first came up with the idea. It was basically, I call it the chicken missile, but basically what happens is that it comes straight at you, straight on, and if you try to dodge it, it always matches your movements, so you can never get away from it, and the trick is to not move, basically. And I love that concept of discovering an enemy that you can't get away from unless you do something very specific. And also I like Andros, the final boss that I programmed. That's one of my favorites. I love, also he says something very secret that nobody's really picked up on. And I like the first boss as well, I think.
As levels and enemies were designed, Super Effects chip bugs squashed, and development continued, a new question emerged. Who was flying these ships?
When it came to talking about details regarding how to make the main characters look and feel, we talked about all sorts of types of people. But ever since I was in school, I drew comics with caricaturized humanoid animals, and decided that the characters in this game should be based off animals. I then talked about it with Miyamoto, the designer, and we thought about the fox image. Then I thought, let's try making a fox the main character.
With Star Fox nearing completion, the game started making appearances at conventions, in magazines, and in TV commercials. The public was getting their first look at Nintendo's premier 3D title on Super Nintendo, and the hype was immediately starting to grow. For one young developer back in England, those advertisements for Star Fox would prove a defining moment for his future career.
Hi, I'm Martin Piper. I was very much a child of the home computers era. It started off with a ZX81, where there were type-in listings in books and magazines, and that really got me hooked into programming at quite an early age. I think I was about 9 or 10 years old. I realized even at that early age that I really wanted to make my own computer games. Eventually got a Commodore 64. There was a lot more vibrant games market for the Commodore 64 than there was for the VIC-20, to be honest. It was a lot easier to pop down the road to the games shops and buy new games. And so I started making early tools and libraries and games, and eventually had a game published. It was called Tusari, which was published on the Zap 64 cover tape. Even back then, some of my old Commodore 64 work discs clearly showed that I was very interested in working on 3D stuff. I would be trying out different vector and rotation routines and different ways of representing 3D graphics. I think that was started very strongly because I saw things like Corona's Rift and stuff like that, and I wanted to do things that were very similar. But being relatively a young teenager at the time, it was difficult to understand some of the mathematics, but I muddled along as best as I could. Seeing things like Dactyl Nightmare, which was the Virtuality W Industries game in the arcades at the time, really sparked my interest. My friend persuaded me to get an Acorn Archimedes, which uses an ARM processor. Now, it was very good at 2D stuff, but I very quickly learned that it was even better at 3D stuff. The ARM chip at the time was extremely powerful, especially for a home computer. And I started working on tech demos. The most I saw at Star Fox, or Starwing as it was in the UK, were preview and review screenshots from games magazines. Because I was working on 3D rendering on the Archimedes at the time, and finding out that the ARM chip could handle texture mapping, shading and lighting, I tried hand creating some of the 3D models and graphics using the magazines as art references from all of the Star Fox Starwing stuff that I was seeing. This was done in a very loose collection of BBC Basic editing tools and hand-drawn vectors on graph paper and so on and so forth. Alan and I kept on adding features to that tech demo, and it really got quite advanced. It was certainly playable as a game. Alan and I, decided it would be a good idea to try to sell our tech demos at an upcoming Acorn computer show. At that computer show, Pete Warnes was at the computer show and he saw our demo.
Pete Warrens was a programmer at Argonaut, and was one of the men credited with helping to develop the Super FX chip. When he saw that Martin had managed to recreate much of what had been developed for Star Fox before he'd even played the game, he knew Martin might be a good fit for Argonaut.
When Peter suggested an interview at Argonaut, I rather jumped at the chance. I remember a couple of long trips to Argonaut's offices, bringing my home machines to demonstrate all of the stuff that I had been working on at the time. Years later, I think the studio manager at the time, Neil Jackson, told me that as soon as they saw me bring all of the machines and go all, like programmery, they knew I would fit in to the company, which was, a very nice thing to tell me.
One could say that Martin was the first person to ever make a fan game of Star Fox, all before he even played the game, and as a result, wound up getting a job at the very company responsible for Star Fox in the first place. Meanwhile, Star Fox had wrapped up development and was ready to be released to the world, and Nintendo fans were ready as well.
I remember seeing either maybe a demo in a store or coverage in a game magazine or something, and just not understanding how this could happen on a Super Nintendo. Just imagining like old tech like the Super Nintendo, like really showing forth that Nintendo, the Gunpei Yokoi style of lateral thinking with their technology. That's what Star Fox felt like, even if the fact that they built the Super FX chip on it was they were making new technology. It wasn't old technology, but it was taking something that this shouldn't have been possible on a Super Nintendo. It was not planned to be a part of the Super Nintendo when that console was developed in the late 80s, but it became part of the Super Nintendo.
I was blown away when I discovered Star Fox with my friends. It was fast, it was difficult, but very enjoyable to play using the gamepad. And the shapes were filled with vibrant colors, and I can still remember that incredible music.
I had all of these games that were 2D, and then this one weird game that was completely 3D. It's a hard concept to explain in modern context, because it was like a thing that didn't exist on consoles. It would be like if today you had your selection of 3D games, and then you had this one random game that was in 4D and existed outside of time. And so there's that one game that's like that's just weirdly on the same system that runs all your 3D games. So that's weird. And so that's what Star Fox was for me as a kid, is it's like this weird game that's totally different from all of the other ones.
Ever since I was a little kid, I've loved something about the art style, the low polygon count, the colors, everything that is aesthetic from the game, everything that you can see and that you can hear. I think it has endless charm.
So I think I was 12 when Star Fox first came out in 1993 for the Super Nintendo. And I think it was one of the first, if not the first, 3D game I had played, so it just blew my mind in that way already. It ran at 10 frames a second or something like that, but to my eyes it was just amazing. And we didn't own a Super Nintendo, but we used to rent them from the video store, and that was just kind of like a special treat that we did a couple times a year. So we'd rent Super Mario World and Star Fox. I just loved the cinematic feel of it, the way the music combined with the dialogue and the combat, and just the little cutscenes at the end of the levels and stuff like that. It was just incredible.
Back when I was a kid, my good friend Adam, he used to have an uncle that lived down my street, right? And this is the guy who basically had enough money to purchase any new Super NES game day one every single time. And we knew this was coming out. And of course, right after school, I find out he's got the game. So we run down there. He's got a big, big for the time, 27-inch Sony Trinitron, and a full stereo setup, which is way beyond anything that I had at my house at the time. And yeah, I played it there. And obviously I was hyped based on all of the commercials running prior to the launch. And we got it, and I was completely blown away. Like, looking back, I'm like, okay, I can see the faults, but at the time, just the idea of playing a game like that on a console with that presentation was really unbelievable. And this is actually the brilliance of Star Fox, I think. Nintendo and the team there found a way to make this game extremely playable at a very low frame rate. And that must have required a lot of very careful design decisions with the way the aiming works and the way the ship moves. And there's just enough weight and movement to it. And positioning of the screen that makes everything still manages to feel very controllable despite the low frame rate.
You had suddenly this pumping soundtrack and colorful world and these chattering characters who would fly past you in real time in need of your assistance. And it kind of felt like a whole new genre was born. Everything about Star Fox is memorable and striking, from the elegant simplicity of the low poly R-wing that's simple enough for a school kid to draw in their school books, as I did plenty, but also that silhouette is iconic, to the sound design, not just the beautifully memorable sound, music, but the sound effects such as the blasters. I think anyone who's played Star Fox can remember those blaster sounds if they hear them, as iconic as a hum of a lightsaber even. And the bosses, they're so satisfying to defeat bosses, which when you do clear them, instead of worrying about the score so much, you're caring about the state of your colleagues, and they come flying in victoriously around you and let you know how you're doing. I think it left a strong impact not just on the genre, but on video games on the whole.
But for Star Fox's developers, news of the title's reception took a little while to arrive and sink in.
Back then there was no internet, so there was no real way to even gauge how well the launch had done. I could only hear about like sort of anecdotal evidence from people at Argonaut who were back in the UK, where they were saying that it was a big thing in the shops over there, and there was this, I'd made this competition cartridge for it, and the competition cartridge was doing really well, and getting people into the shops to kind of try and get their high score. And that was kind of the feedback we got. And I think we saw like a review in one of the magazines back then, maybe Edge magazine even, and it was a great review. And of course there was a review in Famitsu as well, and that was a good review as well.
It was just word of mouth or reviews in magazines, weekly magazines. I think that was actually that was the first time when we saw it was like a really good score on Famitsu. I can't remember what it was, maybe 89 or something like that. 888 or whatever, 999. You get all your info from magazines back then because there's no internet.
And I think it was only maybe a long time afterwards, maybe even a year afterwards, that we actually realized how big a game we'd made.
We were told that it was the fastest selling video game in history. And it sold like 1 million units within a couple of months. So yeah, we weren't expecting that at all. And the reviews obviously were really good. And if you're a pro, when you make a game, all you see when it gets released is all the things that you wanted to put in, or all the things that you wanted to change. You never had the chance. That's all you see when you release a game. So yeah, we weren't expecting it to be so popular.
Star Fox would go on to sell over 4 million copies, and became the 10th highest selling game on the Super Nintendo, outperforming major titles like F-Zero, Mario RPG, Chrono Trigger, and Super Metroid. With the massive success of Star Fox, Nintendo began developing more games powered by the Super FX chip. Giles Goddard would finally get the chance to revive his lost racing game Accelerate as Stunt Race FX, an over-the-top cartoon-inspired 3D racing game. Dylan Cuthbert, meanwhile, would begin developing a sequel to Star Fox.
And Star Fox 2 kind of began probably about April or May, maybe about April, after we'd finished Star Fox 1. Star Fox 2 lasted for about, I think it was probably about 2 years, maybe 2 years and a couple of months, something like that. And we kind of did a lot of experimentation. So the first year was really just playing around, trying different things, doing all range. We tried a 2-player mode, just platform elements. We did all kinds of stuff. I tried pulling the camera back, getting a sort of semi-isometric view with the 3D graphics, and you were kind of running around like a sort of Mario kind of experience. Just lots of stuff, just to see what we could do with the system. And that was like the first year of development. And then we slowly kind of whittled all that down into the game it eventually became.
Shortly before Star Fox 2 was set to release, Nintendo made the shocking decision to cancel the completed game. Over the years, a variety of reasons for why it was canceled have been proposed, but the most well-supported tend to focus on the upcoming hardware from both Nintendo and their competitors.
But at the time, the PlayStation 1 had just come out, and the Saturn, of course, and the 3D quality of the games on those systems was just so good that I did kind of expect it, because there's no way we could get to that quality with the FX chip. It's just older architecture. And you can say that I was sad, but also maybe a little bit relieved that it didn't release at that time. Obviously, it's you can't be very happy that a game you spent 2 years making doesn't come out, but given the rate of change at the time, with like these other consoles coming out, I think it was probably the best decision that that was made at the time.
Many also suspect that the choice was made in part to more clearly highlight the advantages of the Nintendo 64 to potential customers. The Nintendo 64 was presented as the 3D future, and having 3D games on the Super Nintendo may have made this messaging less clear, especially to parents whose grasp of the graphical leap between the generations may not have been as strong. Regardless, Star Fox 2 remained something of a gaming myth. A completed sequel to the SNES classic, entirely separated from the officially released sequel, Star Fox 64. As the years wore on, unfinished builds and prototypes of Star Fox 2 began appearing online, and Star Fox fans took it upon themselves to translate the game, patch its bugs, and keep the name Star Fox 2 alive in the consciousness of that community. Finally, in 2017, over 2 decades after its intended release date, Nintendo announced that Star Fox 2 would be included as a surprise addition to the SNES Classic game system.
Well, I felt surprised that it actually came out eventually, which is really great. I mean, I didn't know about it. I didn't know it was going to come out. I mean, it's out. It's great. It's a thing that I made over 20 years ago and spent a lot of time making. And to have something like that actually come out, it's great. It's just brilliant.
As for Giles, with Nintendo and Argonaut's relationship coming to a close following the cancellation of Star Fox 2, he made the decision to stay in Japan.
We spent like 2 years, a year and a half, say, in Japan doing Star Fox. And by that time, we'd spent so much time here. We had girlfriends, apartments, and everything in the UK had moved on. It was kind of a no-brainer that at least one of us was going to stay in Japan. And I just asked Nintendo. I said, "Can I become a full-time employee?" And they said, "Yeah, okay." So I phoned Jez and said, "I'm sorry, I need to quit. I need to stay in Japan." But after that, Jez changed the company rules of Argonaut, saying that no employees could go and work at Nintendo. So that's why I think it was just me.
Giles would go on to work on many of the Nintendo 64's best games, including The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and 1080 Snowboarding. But perhaps his most famous work on the Nintendo 64 also served as an odd follow-up to his work on Andross's floating head in Star Fox.
On my resume, it says he's the best floating head designer in the world. Doesn't say that. I don't know. You just come across these things. Somebody suggests something, and you end up working on heads. I worked on 2 giant heads. One was Mario 64, and the other was Andross at the end of Star Fox.
These days, both Giles and Dylan are working in Japan and have started their own companies. Both have since worked on multiple projects alongside Nintendo. Dylan has made multiple return visits to the Star Fox series with Star Fox Command on the Nintendo DS and Star Fox 64 3D on Nintendo 3DS. He also developed a sequel to his initial game with Nintendo, X, on Nintendo DS called Xscape. His company, Q Games, recently reacquired the rights to their experimental PS3 title, The Tomorrow Children, from Sony, and have released an enhanced version on PS4 and PS5. Giles, meanwhile, worked on the 3DS launch title Steel Diver and its insanely underrated follow-up, Steel Diver Sub-Wars, in addition to Tank Troopers, also on 3DS. More recently, he worked on Carve Snowboarding, a VR spiritual follow-up to his work on 1080 Snowboarding. He's also been an avid supporter of the Playdate, a micro-game console featuring unique monochrome games. Most recently, his company, Chuhai Labs, served as the producer of the excellent Curse to Golf. While the Star Fox series has continued to develop with varying degrees of success, the influences of those earliest entries are still felt through the work of modern game developers who grew up playing classic Star Fox.
Our game Race the Sun was undeniably inspired by the the low poly, like textureless cubes and visuals from Star Fox from the Super Nintendo. And I like to say that I think the Super NES version still looks superior to the subsequent game on the Nintendo 64, just because it was like more pure, I guess. And I still think that's true. And so Star Fox was influential in Race of Sun, and also our current game that we're making, Whisker Squadron and Whisker Squadron Survivor. Just the corridor shooter format. It's a nice way to kind of like tighten up the gameplay and help you focus on the right things. Not a thing you see a lot in games these days, but I think it was really brilliant.
In 2013, I had this idea of making a rail shooter based on original Star Fox gameplay, but with everything being procedurally generated as Spelunky. No loading time, no blah blah, just non-stop action, the game of my dreams. So I turned to Z Game Editor, an engine for demo makers that produces exe that could fit in an old Atari's diskette. So everything was putting together, and Omeganaut was born. And since then, I'm still working on it from time to time. I know I'm advancing very slowly, but I enjoy making the game I wanted to play as a kid. Some kind of endless Star Fox mission.
In my case, I tried to modernize Star Fox 64 combat, trying to blend that formula of how you see the ship from behind and how a linear level plays out. I tried to mix that with Star Fox Zero's a more free aiming gameplay. But I added a bullet time mechanic so you can slow down time, and then you can look around the ship and you can fire at enemies. And when you destroy enemies, the bullet time regenerates, but you have to be outside of bullet time for this to happen. I think Star Fox is one of the games that is most replayable, particularly 64. But if it wasn't for the foundations that were established on Star Fox Super Nintendo, I think we wouldn't have this generation of developers trying to do on-rail shooters or action games in general wouldn't have evolved in the same way. I think Star Fox has always been about innovation and technology. When you saw Star Fox in '93, there was nothing like it in the Super Nintendo. When you saw Star Fox 64, there was nothing like it in the Nintendo 64.
The legacy of Star Fox is one of excellent game design combined with incredible technical achievement that has rippled out through every 3D game Nintendo has ever made. From Super Mario 64 all the way up to The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Each one can trace some element of its lineage back to Star Fox.
Well, I'm here in Kyoto, Japan, aren't I? So it affected my life pretty hugely. And I think we were very lucky to kind of be in the position to kind of do it at the time, and we were just in the right position with the right skill set. We had 3D knowledge. No one had 3D knowledge in consoles at the time, for Super Nintendo or Nintendo. And we were just there at the right time, at the right moment. And then it just changed everything because I fell in love with like Kyoto and Japan. I started learning the language and just kind of enjoying my life here and realizing that living here would be a lot more preferable to living elsewhere. And basically, even now, 30 years later, Star Fox has still great name value, which is a testament to how solid a game it was back then as well. So yeah, it's been a great journey so far and still quite a way to go as well.
Star Fox basically changed my entire life from being a programmer in the UK to basically working Nintendo in Japan and starting my own company, still working with Nintendo. So it's the kind of the foundation of where I am today. So yeah, it's big.
Obviously, I made 4 Star Foxes already, but there's still a lot more to do in that kind of world, and with the right level of flexibility and sort of in the game design and the right attitude to kind of changing playing around with the ideas and like experimenting with like new like techniques of like 3D rendering even. I think that could be a lot of fun.
I would love to have a stab at making a Star Fox game, but I don't think I would make a different Star Fox game. I'd make a remake of the original, because that's what the people want. I would love to make Star Fox again on either the newest platforms there are, or even a little handheld thing like the Playdate, which I've actually been trying things out on. So yeah, maybe one day we'll see that.
If I was going to remaster Star Fox for a modern platform, I think I would try and keep the sort of retro style. Maybe not the low polygons as such, but at least that kind of style. But I'd also throw in a lot of modern tech, like ray tracing, obviously up the frame rates to as high as it can go, and also resolution as well. Just get everything as high as it can go, and then kind of go to the same kind of system that we used for the original Star Fox. So thanks for 30 years of playing Star Fox. Well, probably not all of you have played it for 30 years, but thanks for remembering the game and still enjoying the memory of it. And hopefully there'll be some great stuff in the future from us as well.
And happy 30th anniversary for Star Fox. I was one of the programmers, and I'm still talking about it today. So here's to another 30 years of Star Fox adventures.
All right, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you may also enjoy my documentary on the making of Star Fox Command for the Nintendo DS. This video was produced in collaboration with the Video Game History Foundation, and you'll want to keep an eye on both their website and their YouTube channel for an upcoming deep dive into Dylan Cuthbert's unseen demo, Eclipse, for the Game Boy. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to Nintendo World Report TV and checking out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more. We'd love to chat with you about this or anything else Nintendo related in our Discord. There's a link in the description. And if you want to chat with me specifically about Star Fox, well, you can hit me up on Twitter using the handle on screen.